Patch 1.6 for Company of Heroes 3 has been a bit of a turbulent one. We got new battle groups, we got a variety of changes related to every faction, and we got many nice things such as a lever penalty, which is the first time the series has ever had one. Overall, I would say the patch has been pretty positive, but from a balance perspective, there are some issues related to it. Notably, the Wehrmacht and the DAK have seemingly been overtuned in their capabilities. And this video is just going to be a short talk about, I think, the most extreme outliers of the balance issues, and if a hotfix were to be made by Relic, this would be my suggestions to change it. Jumping over to the Company of Heroes 3 stats page, we can get a general sense of how the patch has been shaking out. Now, keep in mind that I am using the data from the 6th, 7th, and 8th in order to factor out these early couple days, which have generally inflated discrepancies in win rate. This is kind of seeming like a more standardized thing as people adapt to the different factions and changes that have gone on in the game. It's still not a perfect data set, though. Obviously, we don't have an infinite amount of games. This is considering all ELO ranks, and people are still adjusting to and figuring things out. But I do think it can be useful to get a general sense of how things are. Most notably, the Wehrmacht definitely seems to be the outlier in terms of its performance. It has, in general, a higher than average win rate compared to the allied factions. The DAK, on the other hand, at least in 1v1, seems to mostly be exhibiting about an equal win rate. It seems fairly balanced in smaller modes. Now, as we climb up these ranks, you'll actually start to notice DAK gets better and better as we go on. Its win rate starts to significantly creep up, and it becomes generally the dominant force in larger team games. The only exception to this is seemingly against entire US teams running into entire DAK teams, which, again, probably is just kind of an outlier in the data because this isn't a super concrete set. But the general gist is that it seems like that in 1v1, the Wehrmacht seems to be a bit overtuned. And then in team games, Axis are generally on the stronger side, with DAK becoming a lot more powerful. And this is going to influence my suggestions as we try to figure out why the data is looking like this, even after people have had about a week to adjust, and we're looking at kind of a filtered pool. So let's go ahead and jump in game, and we'll talk about some of the various changes that I would suggest to alter in a hotfix. So to start this off, let's talk about the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht is currently the highest win rate faction, and I think it is clear that there needs to be some changes related to the faction. It seems like overall, the biggest thing that is standing out are the Grenadier units, who have reached a kind of silly point in relation to some of the buffs that they received. Just for the sake of comparison, here is the range of a standard infantry section snare. 15 range is decent and covers a little bit around the unit.
You need us?
Regular Grenadiers have an actually larger area than this. They've always had this, and they sit at about 17 or 18 range. Then you have the Fallschirmjäger, which sits at a flat 20 range. This is getting quite wide already, and in fact, there was a fair amount of people that argued that the Fallschirmjägers should not have this large of a snare range. The fact it was wider than that of a Grenadier was a lot, and that is quite the powerful amount of coverage, especially because it could also do it from camo. Then we get to Vet 1, where we're sitting at about 23 range, which is already quite a bit farther, and you can already see the circle is getting quite large. And then Vet 3 is just ridiculous, sitting at about like 28 range. I mean, just look at how wide this circle is. It's practically zoning like an entire like screen around the unit. It's so much that it's entirely reasonable that grenadiers can essentially walk out of fog of war and snare before you even realize they're there. This is especially exacerbated by the assault grenadier package from Breakthrough, where grenadiers are able to sprint, making their movement far quicker. They're able to essentially run up, and their snare goes from like a almost 30 range to closer to like 40 or even like 45 range when they use this sprint. Combine that with the fact that snares also are dealing more damage at Vet 2, and it's just so much stacking on top of each other, it really cramps down on the ability of vehicles, and especially light vehicles, to really do much against the Grenadier. I think, personally, that the Grenadier's bonus range just really doesn't need to exist in such an extreme form. I think, honestly, the Fallschirmjäger's snare is about as large of a snare range as you should really have in the game, especially for a mainline infantry that already has a lot of other utility. So my suggestion, if a hotfix were to happen, would be to remove the bonus range from both Vet 1 and Vet 2 of the Grenadiers, and instead make it so Vet 2 not only gives the bonus damage, but brings the Grenadier's base range up to that of the Fallschirmjäger, essentially adding 2 or 3 range to it. I think that would already be a notable boost in the power level, but it does a couple notable things. Number one, it obviously stops this very silly entire screen snare from happening, but it also makes it that Grenadiers are not able to get super snares right out of the gate, because all they have to do is just build the infantry officer quarters, and then they have this 23-ish range snare, which is just too much. So that would be my suggestion for Grenadier snares. Now, there is one other part of Grenadiers that I want to talk about, and that is their Vet 1 ability, Medkit, which allows them to heal themselves and nearby squads for 5 health per second, and lasting for 25 seconds. Now, just for comparison, both the headquarters base medical station and the medical bunker heal at 3.2 per second. The base medics cost fuel and manpower to build, and the bunker costs manpower and munitions to build and then upgrade. There is no cost associated with using medkits, while having a higher repair speed. I think this is something that is also hurting or helping the Grenadiers feel so overwhelming in the early game, because Grenadiers just are able to so rapidly heal up nearby squads for no cost. There's no reason to build base medics. There's not even a reason to consider building a medical bunker. You can instead save that 150-ish manpower and just funnel that into getting your infantry quicker, or having a better vehicle timing, or purchasing like a vet upgrade. And I think that this is another element that is turning the Grenadier early game power on its head. And as such, I want to suggest that the other change I would make to Grenadiers would be to add a small munition cost to their Vet 1 ability. This would make it like maybe 10 or 15 munitions, I think, would be a reasonable amount. Enough to where it's not free, but not like so expensive you would never use it. This would make it so using medkits can be a very cheap and effective way to heal on the front line, and also maybe delay your healing for a bit. But if you need long-term healing, a medical bunker or even the medical station in the base would also maybe have a reason to be used. It hopefully keeps the Grenadiers useful with their snares and their merging and their frontline healing, but hopefully makes it less of a, oh, there's no reason to do any healing when your mainline does it for you for free. The final things I want to talk about related to the Wehrmacht is in relation to their battle group specific infantry. This is most notably talking about coastal Italian Coastal with its coastal reserves and artillery officer, and also the Fallschirm Pioneer from the Luftwaffe battle group. All of these units are currently gaining instant Vet 1 from the infantry officer quarters, and I think this is something that really needs to be considered when in relation to their general power level and capabilities. I think of these, the Fallschirm Pioneers are the ones that are potentially the bigger issue overall. Fallschirm Pioneers already are really strong by instantly being able to cap the middle of the map and then build or get into defensible positions and winning that mid-fight. And the ability to then always guaranteed get airborne sprint at a certain timing makes it so that these Fallschirm Pioneers can now heal and capture territory faster. It's I think, a problematic thing that might be if you nerf the regular Grenadiers, you just end up with people just defaulting to this because it's such a power spike. And I think that there has been a solution that really kind of needs to get into the game, and that is delaying the initial call-in time. Essentially, when a match starts, airdropped units need to have a bit of a cooldown from that beginning of the match. Something like 20 to 30 seconds related to the Fallschirm Pioneers, so they can only drop at that time, would make it a little bit more reasonable for them existing. This would make it harder for them to cap several points in the middle, and they would in general be a little less efficient at dominating the central position, which in turn makes it a bit easier to manage even when they get airborne sprint active when officer quarters gets tapped. Now, coastals are a bit of a different story because coastal infantry are generally already dealing with a bit of a nerf. Their sandbag building speed got nerfed, which has slowed down the overall impact that they're able to have. Previously in 1.5, coastal reserves kind of just would insta-build sandbags in front of other infantry and then win those fights, which was a bit silly. That is no longer the case, and has really toned down the capabilities, I think, of the Coastal Reserve Squad. They're still somewhat spammable, and that is somewhat concerning when they also get Vet 1. However, the one thing I think most people could agree on is that the artillery officer does not need to be getting his Vet 1 from the infantry company. Instead, he should be getting it from the Tier 2 in a manner similar to things like Fallschirmjägers. In my opinion, does not make much sense that this officer essentially is always going to be arriving at Vet 1. That's just a lot of power because it buffs up a lot of his effects. Not only does he get the ability to activate this, which makes units around him better, but he also is just having faster recharge times, which means that his magic mortar overwatch ability is just on a faster cooldown. And I don't think that's really needed. If this was moved to Tier 2, it would be a way to slightly tone back, make the artillery officer not insta-arrive at Vet 1, and maybe bring down Coastal a bit. There is maybe also an argument that the Coastals themselves need changes because they reach Vet 1 so quickly and then can rapidly reach Vet 2, but that's something to have a discussion about. I think it's something that people can talk about and maybe is up to the relic itself to decide. But I definitely think the artillery officer needs to be locked to like the higher tier officer quarters in order to get his vet. So moving over to DAK, I think there is a reasonable expectation to say that DAK is not nearly as broken as the Wehrmacht is, at least in smaller game modes. However, when you go into team games, it seems like the DAK has really become the menace of that mode. The more DAK you have in a team game, generally the more the Axis are winning. And in my opinion, this is because of the buffs related to the Tier 3 tech, and specifically the Tiger rushing. So, Construct Panzer, the Panzer Army Command, went down 20 fuel and cost overall, and then also went down 100 manpower. This makes it extremely quick and cheap to build. And then on top of that, armored reserves got cheaper, and then the Tiger went down 60 fuel. This is just like essentially making the Tiger like 70 fuel faster and several hundred manpower cheaper to immediately get out. This has made the Tiger a lot easier to actually rush, and it's not uncommon that Tigers are hitting around 15 to 20 minutes in their timing, which just is very, very fast for how powerful the Tiger is. Just for reference, we have a little test here. We're just going to quickly show off how the Tiger matches up against these AT guns, and hopefully we'll see just an example of what the Tiger can do if it gets a couple lucky shots. So one is decrewed in 2 shots. And likely the other one will be decrewed here in a moment. But hopefully this is just kind of like a quick example. But the Tiger, it was faced off against 2 AT guns, and even if I had the Tiger drive in from max range, I think there's a reasonable expectation that it is able to decrew both AT guns. And that is really, really powerful for how quickly this hits. There's not a lot of heavy AT that is out there, and the Tiger just has the chance to instantly one-shot enemy AT guns and infantry squads because its cannon has incredible AoE damage on it. In my opinion, this is what is causing a lot of discrepancy in team games. The Tiger is too powerful and too bursty in its damage for the health of team games, and the Allies are struggling to have any counters to it. In my opinion, the way to fix this is to directly nerf the Tiger by lowering the amount of damage it can do. We actually have a good example of how this was before. If people remember back in, I believe, 1.2 or 1.3, the Sherman Easy 8 had a similar issue where its AoE profile was really, really high, and it essentially would just, like, in 1 or 2 shots decrew AT guns, it could wipe squads of infantry, and the Tiger's kind of doing the same thing. So if you bring the Tiger down in a similar manner to that by making its AoE smaller, maybe putting a model cap on its main cannon, I think the Tiger would feel a bit more consistent and a little less explosive without needing to, say, put it back at 240 manpower and just try to bury it away where nobody gets to play with it. I think it's cool the Tiger gets played with now. It just needs to be fine-tuned for the fact that people are actually able to get it before, like, a 40-minute time mark. Now, the other thing I think that should be considered to change within the DAK is related to the Battlefield Espionage Battle Group. I believe that a notable issue kind of exists within the Battlefield Espionage related to some of its early CP unlocks that just overall contributes to some frustrating gameplay that is powerful enough to be relevant, but not like broken overpowered. It's just very frustrating and doesn't feel that exciting to fight. And I think the main culprits are the Funk Panzerwagen being able to conceal vehicles, and then the Sector Subterfuge Beacon, I think, being very cheap and easy to spam. Let's start off by talking about the Funk Panzerwagen. So this is a very powerful vehicle. It's cheap, easily replaceable, and has a lot of things going for it. It can capture territory. When you vet it up, it just outright provides with free munition income. Like, a Vet 1 Funk Panzerwagen is a free 5 munitions every minute, just outright boosting your munition economy. It's able to play with Goliaths. It buffs your infantry with both the camouflage and also gives them combined arms. It's a very powerful effect, and definitely a centerpiece of the battle group. However, its ability to hide vehicles, I think, is leading to extremely blobby playstyles. Even more so than that of, like, regular than what the battle group would normally do. People were going to blob around this thing no matter what. It's unavoidable when you have a limited area to camo your units. But being able to take a medical truck, make it invisible, means that this blob is now able to reinforce if it just so happens to take any damage and then break off a combat. And that is the problematic element, in my opinion. It's most notable with the medical truck, but it also has issues in relation to vehicles, as damaged vehicles can essentially just go freely hide and then be repaired close to the front line without really the enemy being able to see and engage it. You do, of course, have things like detectors that are able to spot this, such as, like, say, a Humber. But, see, the problem with something like the Humber is that it has to get close, and very often this blob is just able to, like, bring in Panzerjägers, or it has access to something like Panzer Grenadiers that will then throw a snare at it. It's just overall, like, a lot going on. And I also think that the Funk Panzerwagen kind of takes away from Operation Scorpion, as this is supposed to be the way you camouflage your vehicles. Yet, this just does it for free and no cost and comes like, what, 6-7 CP sooner? Of course, the Scorpion does also give, like, some bonus to rate of fire and also refund stuff, but that's kind of it, especially because the vehicles move slower. These vehicles don't get slowed when they're camo, they move full speed. In my opinion, this is a notable aspect of the Funk Panzerwagen that needs to be removed. If it didn't hide normal vehicles, I think it would feel a little less frustrating, because medical trucks would be more exposed to AT weapons and whatnot. Light vehicles couldn't just instantly disappear in the fog of war and just be completely impossible to chase or hunt down. And I think it would just overall also make Operation Scorpion feel much more compelling, as it would be the only way to hide your vehicles. Also worth noting that you would be able to you would probably need to make an exception for the Goliath, as the Goliath does really rely on this camo in order to be effective. But I do think that that's fine. This is a very unique vehicle. It's specifically spawned from the Funk Panzerwagen, so I think it's fine if the Goliath is made like the one exception for vehicles being hidden. Now, the other change is related to the Sector Subterfuge Beacon. This is a 0ZP call-in that allows that for 75 manpower, it will steal 75% of resources from a resource point, giving it to you, but also slows the capture and decapture rate of enemy squads by 67%. And that is the notable effect. Now, overall, I would say the biggest thing is the slowing of capture rate. You can place this in very safe positions, and if the enemy is fighting for a front line and tries to cap a point, they get slowed down by these beacons, and it can be difficult to spend time and resources trying to reveal these camoed things, while there's also, like, say, a blob of ambush units waiting to jump on you when you're overextended. I think that there needs to be maybe a small change related to the beacons. Maybe raise their manpower cost to 100 to make them a little less spammable. It would help to just slightly bring this into line and make it so if you're really leaning hard on these beacons, they are going to bleed the DAK for manpower. It's a small nerf, and maybe there even needs to be something like this be 60% of a munition point, or maybe even something like 50%, or maybe the capture speed debuff goes to maybe 50%. Like, maybe these numbers need tweaking, but I think a small change to this would just make it a little less frustrating and feel a little less like whack-a-mole, where these things are still important to find and get rid of, but they're not so detrimental that they're very frustrating if you can't find it, because they can be tucked away in very annoying places to get in various areas. The British faction is one that currently does not sit on a very high win rate, which seems to be part of the Wehrmacht's really overtuned early game being very difficult for the Brits to cope with. They struggle to really deal with the CQC tools that the MP40 Grenadiers have, and that seems to be really driving down the British win rate. On top of that, there's a couple other things that seem a bit undertuned in the British. Notably, the Australian battle group seems like it's a bit on the soft side. However, I think there is one thing that is still almost undeniable, and that is the fact that the British M3 Grant is really overtuned. It is a monster, and probably just the best medium tank outside of, like, the Easy 8. It is extremely potent and is very, very dangerous. And that, I think, needs to be fixed, because if the Grant remains so dominant, not only does it make the rest of the British tier 3 kind of irrelevant, but it also just makes it very difficult to have a balanced game, because the Brits just so severely punch down on late game access unless they have something really overtuned or win early, that there needs to be better balance. So, just for the sake of an example, I have 3 Grants here. I have set them to 720 health. Essentially, this is going to simulate what would happen if Grants were to lose the 120 health they got in patch 1.5. This would make Grants a bit squishier, the same health as a Panzer IV. And this is just going to be a test to see how they perform in that way. Let's go ahead and get this started just to see. But we'll see how these Panzer IVs do. Now keep in mind, these Panzer IVs do have that bonus vet reload, allowing them to have a higher rate of fire. Overall, the fight is seeming still in favor of the Grants. There's 2 wins, and then a trade. So, just as an example, that would be what Grants would be like if they had 720 health. They're still better than that of the Panzer IVs, which does make sense as they do have a bit of a side tech cost slowing them down. Although, keep in mind, they are still cheaper fuel-wise than a Panzer IV. And overall, I think it would be reasonable to say that Grants should probably go down to 720 health. It would bring them more in line with other medium tanks, but they still retain their great rate of fire, good damage, and overall solid armor. Now, that's not the only change I'm going to suggest to the British faction. I think in specific, there are a couple changes that could be made to 2 major elements. First off is the company command post. Within the company command post, we have, I think, 2 units that are underrepresented in their usage throughout the British as of late. Starting off are the Foot Guards. Foot Guards have always been a weird unit because they're very difficult to use as CQC troops because the bazookas end up taking away from their SMGs, and it just overall is a bit of an awkward unit. However, we've seen that Stoss troop in the Wehrmacht went to 380 manpower, and Foot Guards really didn't get changed. I think it should be considered to lower Foot Guards in a similar manner, at least matching Stoss troop at 380 manpower. I think would be a reasonable change just to make them a little bit more appealing. This is kind of in an attempt to compensate a bit for any nerf to the Grant, because if the Grant goes away, it does look like British Tier 3 is a lot less appealing, so I think there should be some changes. Then let's talk about the Crusader. The Crusader has just had a rough time, and the biggest thing, I think, is its low health. At 600 health, the Crusader just really doesn't have any claim to fame. It's very, very vulnerable and dies quickly to most other medium tanks, especially as buffs continue to rack up. I think that there is some buff needed. What exactly is up for debate? Maybe the Crusader can be made a bit cheaper and be like a spammable throwaway medium, not intended to really brawl, but instead outnumber? Or maybe the 6-pounder gun conversion could be a way to turn the Crusader into much more of a legit medium tank. It obviously buffs the damage and penetration and whatnot, which makes it a lot more powerful, but maybe it could also do something like buff the health. If the Crusader went to something like 720, like, say, the Grant, or say something like the Panzer IV, or maybe what the Grant should be, maybe the Crusader 3 would be a bit more of an appealing option to have around. It would be faster, better at diving than something like the Grant, and although it's not as good in head-on fights, it would at least maybe retain some purpose. But I think overall that there definitely needs to be some small tweaks related to Tier 3 in order to compensate for the Grant being nerfed by buffing up some of the lesser used units here. Now, moving on to battle group specific things, I think it is fairly safe to say that the Australian battle group has been a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, there are a couple really good things in here, like the Archer Tank Destroyer, the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, and over-repair seem to be some of the more standout options. However, there is also a couple things that I think have ended up a bit underwhelming that could use some changes. And most of this is related to the Australians and emplacements. So starting with the Australians, they are 300 manpower. And the one issue with it is that they lack any AT, they can't get access to grenades. And overall, the Australians are very much a sit there and kind of shoot at the enemy in order to do their job. They do have really high capping speed, but the thing that seems to be holding them back is that they're 300 manpower. I think there should be a consideration to bump this down a little bit. A conservative buff would be something like 290, just a little bit cheaper, or a more, I think, my personal suggestion would be to make them 280 manpower. This would put them as not as expensive as something like the DAK Panzer Grenadiers, but not exactly as cheap as, say, a baseline infantry section. Just a little bit higher in order to compensate for their capping power and some of their utility, like building sandbags. Now, it is worth noting that their sharpshooter training is not fully working at the moment. Their Vet 3 is not operating to my knowledge, which does mean that their late game potential is a bit held back. And as such, you have to be careful about buffing them, because these guys are already feeling pretty solid in the late game. However, it is also worth mentioning that you can just also have a similar term of performance by just going infantry sections with a Bren. This is very similar in performance to the upgraded Australian Lights, unless the Australians use their sharpshooter ability, which does help them in overpowering infantry sections, but they don't have snares, and rifle grenades are also an option. So I think there's a bit of competition here, and the Australians just need a little bit cheaper cost in order to really feel good and exciting to use. Then moving on to emplacements, the emplacements are kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, the 17-pounder emplacement is actually pretty good. The biggest thing is that it has a super massive range. This thing is like, I believe 90 range is what it has. Super far, which is actually very solid. It does cost quite a lot of manpower, but this is overall, I think, a solid emplacement. It has a purpose in at least team games, where you're able to use it to really zone out enemy LVs, or enemy vehicles, in a way that is hard for them to respond without artillery. However, one unit that has not performed is the Bofors. And the reason for this is related to the squad health. Simply put, The emplacement of the buffers is very easy to decrew. 600 HP, because it only has 3 models, is just not really sustainable. Because if we look at the cost, it's 35 fuel. That's quite a lot of fuel for an emplacement that doesn't really move, obviously, and then also is unable to really even fight stuff because it just gets decrewed too quickly. My suggestion would be to at least include one additional squad member here, maybe standing on the other side of this guy, or maybe just standing in the trench itself, just in order to make it so this is able to have like 800 health or something like that, and just be a little more durable to recrewing. The veterancy does improve this. It is worth noting, for example, we went from 600 to 720, and then up to, leave that 3, or, oh no, it only goes to 720, but I still think it's just a bit too vulnerable to being decrewed to really feel that extremely powerful for its cost. So either you have to make it cheaper, or you have to give it more health, and I would rather it have a bit more health, because this being spammable is a bit silly. But that's my opinion. Then, the final thing to talk about is, I think, Hold the Line. Hold the Line is just not that good. It competes with vehicle over repair, which is really, really strong, keep in mind. This is extremely powerful, and Hold the Line just currently does not hold a candle to it. And the reason for this is that it relies on the emplacements, which at the moment are not that powerful, especially the buffers. But even the 17-pounder emplacement, although good, it's difficult to really like commit super hard to them. Even if you're doing stuff like also building an HMG nest, it's just not really worth it to go heavy on emplacements with the way the game and the balance is at the moment. And Hold the Line does not give you enough reason to do so. So in my opinion, there needs to be some improvement to this. Of course, this is a difficult thing to balance, because if this becomes too good, it becomes the brace ability from Coh3, and that's really annoying to deal with. But maybe, for example, you could increase the time it lasts for a bit, like to 40 seconds. Or something like that. Or maybe it increases the repair speed, like maybe it could go to 6 health per second or 8 health per second in order to have a very powerful but limited time effect.
Ready for trouble.
It's a bit hard to say, but, you know, it's just currently this is not really up to snuff. And it needs a bit more oomph behind it in order to be worthwhile to go over the repair effect. And that is going to be the end of my suggestions for the hotfix. You will notice I have not talked at all about the US forces, and that is very deliberate, because I don't think the US is actually that bad off. It's struggling against those outliers like the Grenadiers and the early Tigers from the Axis factions, but if those get nerfed, I think the US will feel generally pretty well balanced, having strong tools and options and some diversity in how it plays. If there are changes to the USF, I worry that they might be acting in a manner that is going to overcorrect the issue. You're going to go from the Wehrmacht being too strong to the US being too strong, and I would rather that not happen. If we round down the power of certain outliers, I think the USF will feel just generally pretty well. That's not to say the US is perfectly balanced. There are changes that are needed, but I don't think there's any emergency changes needed in a hotfix that, you know, needs to be pushed out the door sooner rather than later. The British, on the other hand, just for a bit more explanation, I think do deserve a couple buffs in the hotfix because their late game power is very centered around the Grant, and if you nerf that, you need to make sure they're not going to completely collapse. And on top of that, their new battle group does have some weaker elements that could maybe use a little love in order to reinforce it as a strong and viable option. Otherwise, that's been my suggestion list. In the comments, give your thoughts. Do you agree with my changes and proposals? Do you think I've overlooked something? Or do you think I'm being too harsh on certain factions? I'm curious for people to discuss down in the comments. And make sure to also like and subscribe for more Company of Heroes content and discussions related to it. Otherwise, I want to thank you watching all the way through and have a good day.